Good morning, everybody, and here we are with another episode of Existential Ambiguity. I think. Well, no, ambiguity doesn't have to mean confusion, but ambiguity means a lack of definiteness, a lack of certainty. So the uncertainty in our idea of what we are, how we exist, existential, is the existential ambiguity. We think we are.
We experience that we are.
Yes, and then we go in search of our being, and we can't find it. So, this is the really strange thing about life.
We seem to be, and everyone else does too.
Yeah, but when we actually go in search of that being and try to get certainty on it, it's very slippery. We can't really say for sure what we are. Adolescents feel this uncertainty very keenly. Their whole life, their identity has simply been the son or daughter of so-and-so, their parents.
And you can observe that they adopt so many traits from them also.
But in adolescence, the emphasis shifts from defining identity in terms of your relationship with parents to identifying as your own person. And this is very difficult. It's much more difficult than we recall. At the time, we go through extreme anxiety. Most people don't remember it because they haven't gone back in psychotherapy and relived those times.
For most people it was so traumatic that they hid it from themselves.
They had to bury it because they just couldn't deal with it. This is why in adolescence, many of the bad habits that follow us throughout life, like drinking and smoking and various kinds of intoxication or sexual addiction or like that, these habits are begun in adolescence as a response to this existential crisis. Trying to understand, who am I? We also see people develop following behaviors, imitation behaviors of their certain movie stars or music stars or various role models, idols, or maybe they become very religious, fanatically religious, or they become addicted to a certain living style.
Almost everyone conforms to the group mind.
Well, to some degree you have to. But
in different groups.
We see it in an extreme in adolescence, where people literally will join a crowd, a gang, maybe even literally a gang, or figuratively, a gang such as punkers, or the nerds, the gamers, or the sports people, or some tribe. And this is not a new thing. This has been going on for thousands of years. In our research into early Vedic culture, we found that the teenagers in those days had groups called yutas, from which our word youth is derived. And they would hang out together and
based on their interests.
So many things as a group, yes. And of course their main interest was concealing their activities from their parents. So nothing much has changed.
No.
They want to do that because they're making this shift from defining their identity in terms of their relationship with their parents to some other platform.
Some other group.
And it's very difficult.
And the tendency is, once you've chosen the group, you conform pretty severely with that group.
Well, yeah, because the consequences, if you don't, can be that you get disenfranchised.
Yeah.
You get kicked
out of the group.
Yeah. And then where are you? You're right back where you started.
Well, in my experience, I was like nomadic, so I jumped from group to group. So I had a different self with every group, because every group gave me something, and I was studying other people's consciousness.
So you had an identity for every day of the week, and extra one for Sunday, huh?
But I thought I had the same identity, but now it's becoming more clear that it was different identities, that it brought out different aspects.
That's an interesting observation. We think our self, or I, is always the same. But on close inspection, we find out it's actually different.
They're just labels on sense objects.
And that's why when we're in the association of one group of people, we act in a certain way. And when we're with different people, we act in a different way. And maybe we don't even see it at the time.
No.
Maybe we can be completely oblivious to it.
Maybe many people can't even see it when you say it, because they've created this story about their self that's so well written.
Self in quotes. Right?
Yeah. It's so well written that they trick themselves into believing that it's the same self all over.
Yeah.
I tried to talk to my father and my sister about this, and they were convinced that they had the same self
at all times.
At all times, yeah. Wasn't any different at work or at home.
That is the myth of personal existence. That is the myth of the I, or the self. That is the story that we tell ourselves to convince us that we have a real identity, when in fact our so-called identity is actually synthetic. It's actually something we create out of nothing, basically, in association with various sense objects. And those can be groups of people, they can be a particular drug, like you got your speed freaks and your smokers and the psychedelic crowd, and they're all slightly different. No?
Can be a style of music,
or the drinkers.
It can be a sports team.
Yeah. So we find that people are basing their identity on some external factor.
Economic class.
Yeah.
That's big when you grow up.
Oh, yeah. Well, all the time. Money is the biggest differentiator in the consensus society. How much money you have and what you do with it is probably the biggest question of our time.
Yeah.
It's the thing that defines people. And in the public arena.
How other people judge you.
Yeah, by your income, by your stuff. And this is, of course, really very far away from anything like a real self. A real self should be permanent. It actually should have the same qualities all the time. It actually should not be based on anything external, but it should be something internal. And now the regular philosophers, the traditional philosophers, have attempted to define self in terms of religious values, our relationship with God, or whatever transcendental existence we postulate. I want to say imagine. Because none of these things can be proved. They're simply ideas. The idea of God.
They're fabrications that you accept from some authority, like the priest or the guru.
Right. And the authority is there to give weight to the postulation.
The argument that can't be verified.
Right. It can't be verified, so we're going to back it up with some kind of civil or ecclesiastical authority.
In Christianity is almost only based on the authority, but I was going to say that the appeal of the Vedas was that when you followed the procedure, you actually got some of the result. You got bhava and transcendental feelings and stuff like that.
Well, the yoga process is very interesting because the yoga process actually does give some result. Well, but even the faith-based process of, let's say, the Christians,
they also go
gives
into bhava
some result.
Yeah.
It gives some result, and that is used as evidence to say that the whole thing is true. Okay, but actually we know that these same results can be gotten from faith in any kind of identity.
Bhava you can manifest bhava just by listening to some good music.
You can manifest bhava with your teddy bear. I mean, you can,
yes,
or with a pet dog or something. You know? That just because you can manifest bhava to the idea of God, that doesn't prove that the idea of God is true. It proves that you can mock up bhava to anything. And artists do this all the time.
Yes.
Do you suppose when an artist goes out on stage and sings their number one hit for the 4,753rd time, that they're still feeling the same thing they felt when they wrote the song? You know,
maybe if not enough people are listening and giving them their energy.
If that's even possible, it would seem like it would get pretty stale. That's why I chose to be a jazz musician, because at least in jazz, you get to do things different every time. People don't expect it to be the same. But in pop music, they expect it not only to be the same, but to sound exactly like the record. It's expected. And so you have to get together all those emotions and make a performance. And you just might not be feeling like it at all, you know. That's why so many of these people lip sync. That's why so many use ghost musicians and like that. A ghost track, it's that shop talk for a backing track that was cut in the studio, and everybody gets up on stage and makes a big show of playing, but they're not really playing. Because the dance routines or the performance just the fact of getting up on stage in a big venue is so intimidating of an experience. It's really hard to play well under those conditions. What to speak of exactly duplicate a performance that may have even been done by a different musician.
And why do people hate it when it's different? It's because they're identified with that song.
That's right. Their ego is identified with that particular recording. And so when they see it live, they're paying like a huge amount of money to go to these concerts. And they want it to be exactly like the recording, except better, with musicians actually there and actually performing and so. But to create that kind of an illusion is so difficult. You know, it's no wonder these pop stars get into drugs and stuff like this, because they have to be so phony. That's expected.
Yeah, so they're mocking up an identity that's phony, like on the face of it.
Yeah, and then clinging to it. And then other people cling to it and use it as a basis for their personality. Like we used to say back in New York, their poisonality. Yeah, he's a real big poisonality. You know what I mean? So we're going to continue with Weti Muni's book. I hope you enjoyed our introduction today. We're going to continue with Weti Muni's book, Buddha's Teaching and the Ambiguity of Existence, which is an existentialist view of the Buddha's teaching. And we're in the middle of chapter 4, which you can download from our site. There's a link in the post, the blog post, where you're listening. There's a PDF file that you can download with the text. And we're at the beginning of a new section called Clinging and Desire. And I'm going to read from Weti Muni's book. So far, what we have discussed as the basic structure of the process of appropriation, of bringing the immediate experience into subjection, is also the basic structure of what the suttas call upadana, which can be translated as holding or clinging. Herein we will render upadana as clinging. Okay. Wetimuni in his original edition uses holding. But I think clinging is better because clinging, at least in American English, has the sense of desperation. Cling, let's see. Cling, to hold on tightly to something. To adhere or stick firmly or closely to. Be hard to part or remove from. And remain very close to. Remain persistently or stubbornly faithful to something. And finally, be overly dependent on someone emotionally. So I think clinging is actually better than holding. Holding has a much less compulsive ring to it.
Yeah, more neutral.
Yeah. Whereas clinging really brings out the fact that what the things we cling to are compulsions. They're obsessions.
Yes.
They're habits that we can't give up very easily. So we're going to use clinging. Upadana, or clinging, covers a wider field than appropriation or bringing into subjection, but fundamentally, in essence, it refers to the same thing. Thus, the 6 stages of the root structure of the Pratujana's reflexive experience described above are, in the language of the suttas, also progressive levels of explicitness in the root structure of the phenomenon of clinging. Now, when I post this, I'm going to post the diagram of the 6 stages of the root structure at the top of the post, so you can refer to it while you're listening to this. The 6 stages are: the Pratujana sees X. That's the immediate experience. He just sees it. Then he sees X as X. He recognizes it. Oh, that's a chair or a car or my friend or whatever. And then gradually he begins to conceive. And conceive, of course, in this case means to add something to the experience that wasn't originally there. What is he adding? The concept of I and mine. So this is appropriation. Appropriate means take something for one's own use, typically without the owner's permission. In other words, it's a nice word for stealing. So it's also a symptom of egotism. When someone simply appropriates something from another person's home or space or whatever, we consider them very egotistical, very selfish. Like someone who comes in and just sort of plops down on your couch and, opens up the refrigerator and gets himself something to drink, turns on his favorite TV show and,
Yeah, invades so many other countries.
Yes, well, this is going on at all scales in society. This appropriation based on egotism is the basic structure, psychologically, of clinging. Okay, so as the root structure develops through the 6 stages, from conceiving X, to conceiving X as X, to conceiving in X, conceiving from X, conceiving X is mine, and then finally enjoying or delighting in X. These are progressive levels of explicitness in the root structure of the phenomenon of clinging. That's given in the diagram, the pyramid diagram, where each stage becomes the foundation of the next. Yet they're all going on simultaneously in the mind. Okay, but they all have to happen in order to bring the experience into subjection. This is the thing. We want to be the king. We want to be the God. We want to be the owner, the controller, the enjoyer. We want to be the man. We want to be the center of our world. So we try to bring everything around us, everything that we're in touch with, everything that we perceive into subjection. And anybody who's been in a relationship knows this is going on all the time. Trying to control each other, trying to determine which way the relationship goes, or even things as simple as what to have for dinner tonight become conflict because one person is clinging to one idea, the other person is clinging to another idea. And so all over the world, at every scale, we can see this conflict or competition arising due to the phenomenon of clinging. Clinging is a very deep phenomenon in the human mind, and it's due to the process by which we create this false self. If we were to stop this process, well, it would be a much nicer place to live here in the world. But there wouldn't be this concept of mine, because the concept of mine is what the I is built on. So we've already gone into this in great detail in previous episodes of the podcast. If this isn't clear, you should go back and re-listen to those. Assuming that anybody is listening to this at all. I think one or two people are following. But someday we'll be famous.
Yes, I and you will be famous.
So anyway, let's go on with Weti Muni's book, because it's interesting. As we pointed out above, the earlier levels of this root structure are not easy to observe. It takes considerable effort to see that the root structure of the Putujana's reflexive experience are even roughly as described in the suttas. But,
because people are so busy with the story. And
if you sit down, but if you sit down and you clear your mind and you calm your emotions, and you watch your breathing for a while, and just let everything settle, sooner or later, something's going to happen. A dog will bark, you hear somebody talking, a car will go by, and you get a chance to watch how you react to it. And how you react to it is inevitably exactly the same as described in the root structure. First, there's the immediate experience. Then there's the recognition. Then you begin to conceive, whether it's a pleasant thing or an unpleasant thing. You still have to make it yours. It's my unpleasant dog barking disturbing my meditation. Yes. It's my unpleasant, the neighbors talking too loud while I'm trying to think here. We make it ours, because then the next step is we're going to try to control it. We're going to take ownership of it, and then we're going to try to manipulate it.
And give the mind a chance to go on one of those long tirades of thoughts.
And pretty soon you're thinking about this Mickey Mouse cartoon that you saw when you were 6 years old, which has nothing to do whatsoever with what was going on.
Yeah, but then you can try to trace it back. That's fun.
Well, yeah, but Buddha says that. He says people try to identify with the mind, which is always changing. It's never the same even for a few moments.
No.
And he says it always change. What does he say? It arises in one way, and then it passes away in another way.
Yeah.
Right?
That's something else.
Yeah, it never remains the same. And yet people are trying to base their identity on this mind. I think. Well, what you think is more insubstantial than the puff of smoke coming off of this incense stick over here. It's like so changeable and so evanescent. I'm into that word these days.
Yeah.
So evanescent, it just evaporates within seconds. So how can we base our identity on our thoughts?
And totally dependent on conditions.
Yes. So when you watch your thoughts for any amount of time, you start to think, this is ridiculous. Why am I doing this? Even the Buddha said, better that you at least use the body as a source of your identity, because the body persists for some time.
Yeah.
You know, you can't really see the changes in the body from day to day. From day to day, it appears to be the same, you know, lump of meat and bone and blood and gluck. But the mind is changing every second. So if you want to base an identity on something, better you base it on the body, you know? And we see that simple, physical-oriented people are always happier and more grounded and together than intellectual, learned people. In fact, there was a study done by the United States government that showed that the more years of formal education a person has, the more likely they are to commit suicide later in life. So what we are saying is, if you identify with your mind, it's a less stable basis for your identity than simply identifying with the body. So these 6 stages of the root structure are really how clinging develops. Appropriation is really another word for clinging. The word appropriation includes 2 aspects: making something mine and doing it without permission. In other words, we're simply asserting that the thing is mine. Look at these explorers that came over from Europe to America and places like that. They just came off the boat with a big flag or something, stuck it in the ground, and said, "This is mine." And
just killed everyone that was in the way.
That's right. That was their game. And they justified it by some kind of extended ego in the form of patriotism to the queen or king or
civilization.
Yeah, right. We're giving these poor savages our civilization, our great civilization that involves just killing everybody that doesn't agree.
The barbarians invading a pretty high society at that time.
Yeah, the Native Americans were a very advanced society, but most of them were killed not by the explorers directly, but by the diseases that they introduced. Because there was measles, mumps, chickenpox, smallpox, the Black Plague.
And they put all that in the blankets that they gave to them.
Well, they were there anyway.
Yeah.
Just that the Europeans had developed immunity to those germs, whereas the Native Americans had not. So wherever the white people went, they introduced diseases that wiped out the majority of the Indian population. And by the time the settlers got to the Mississippi, the Indian cities that had been there were abandoned, and the Indians themselves were reduced to roving bands of hunters, basically. Whereas before they had had an extensive agriculture and so on and so forth. But it all broke down because of plagues, epidemics. So this is going on, this clinging, this ego, this appropriation, which is seen as pleasurable. That's why these rascals can do it. They enjoy it. They enjoy it. So...
And they don't see the relation to the suffering that comes after.
No, they don't see. They think it's...
That's other people doing stuff to me.
Right, other people's fault. Because after all, I am completely justified. So, clinging and desire are very intimately linked in the reflexive experience. So when the Putujana means someone who does not know the Buddha's teaching, when he develops this feeling of clinging or appropriation of his experience, then desire springs up from that. And desire is called nandi or chanda in the suttas. And here's a quote. To him delighting in that feeling, welcoming it, standing attached to it, desire is born. This feeling of enjoying, the feeling of pleasure in appropriating one's experience, gives rise to desire. Hey, that was good. Let me do that again. Or let me do more of it. Or whatever. And this is from the Mahatanha Sankhya Sutta, which is part of the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length discourses of the Buddha. So what is desire? Desire is clinging to the perception of pleasurableness that there is in being, appropriating it, and not letting it go. You're mine, and I'll never let you go, baby. It's there in the popular songs. It's all there.
It's all over the place.
Yes, because everyone is suffering from this desire. This is a kind of disease. It's a kind of addiction. It's a kind of compulsive, obsessive behavior, that one experiences this pleasure, not exactly of the sense object itself,
but the idea
that it's mine. Okay, that's why we make a distinction between pleasure and pleasurableness. Okay, pleasurableness, the perception of pleasurableness is a mental experience. As opposed to a physical experience. And earlier we noted that you can have a physical experience which is painful or uncomfortable, but get pleasure out of it. Or like running, for example, or working out, doing martial arts or something like that. Whereas you can have an experience that's that's pleasant physically, but displeasurable mentally. Yeah. So all these things are going on because we have this habit of appropriation and not letting things go. It becomes compulsive, habitual. Okay. So this is clinging. I'm going to go on here. But since clinging is fundamentally considering or taking a thing as I, desire is taking the perception of pleasurableness in being as I. Okay? This is the difference between clinging and desire. Clinging is fundamentally considering or taking a thing as I. And mine is also part of I, of course.
Yeah.
Anything that's mine is part of I.
And self is like this, the long story about the I. And
the
mine.
Abstraction of the whole thing, I and mine, yeah. But desire is taking the perception of pleasurableness in being as I. When being I is pleasurable, we take that as our desire. This is my desire. This is what I want. I could do this forever. I could do unlimited quantity of this.
Because you had one positive experience of it at some point.
Right.
And then even though it's suffering or painful after some time, like smoking, for example, first puff you take is like, oh, maybe nice.
Take a puff. It's springtime.
And then you're already identified with it. And then later it becomes painful, but it's still, you have this pleasurable idea.
Well, let me go on because he gets into that, the anticipation. Okay, so the distinction is clinging is considering or taking something as I, whereas desire is taking the perception of pleasurableness in being that as I. Okay, so yes, you can have something like smoking, which is actually physically painful and destructive, but which is taken as I because it gives a pleasurable impression in the mind. In desire, there is not only the perception of pleasurableness in being, but also taking this perception of pleasurableness in being as I. In other words, there's an element of egotism in it. Egotism means taking pleasure in being I. Thus, desire is perceiving the perception of pleasurableness in being as I. That sounds very abstract, but it's an experience that we have all the time.
Well, as long as you're smoking that thing, you're maintaining that identity of I. If you weren't, then you would have to fill that time with something else that would make yourself seem permanent.
It's a hand-to-mouth habit. And yes, how would we fill the time? It's called a pastime. A pastime is something that we do. We don't really have to do. There's nothing forcing us to do it except our own mental compulsion. And the compulsion is based on repeatedly perceiving the perception of pleasurableness, the mental pleasure in being as I. Why? Because if I own and control and decide what I do for no other reason than because I want to do it, this is based on the pleasure of being I. I, the great me.
I choose to do it.
Yes.
Well, if you look at it, it's all mechanical. It's all compulsive.
It is under the surface, but we don't like to look at that part. We don't like to see the machinery under the hood.
So we make up a story about it.
Yeah, we just want the show. We just want to see the show. We don't want to know about what goes on backstage.
Oh, we want to know.
We do, and that's why we're doing this. We're doing this podcast, not only for the people who are interested, but really for ourselves, to clarify these ideas in our own minds.
Everyone who knows that what goes on backstage is what really matters anyway.
Well, right, the insiders. The real drama is backstage.
Yes.
You think the show is cool. The show is just what we want to show you. The real stuff goes on where you can't see. And that's the thing. What you can't distinguish runs you. That's Werner Erhard's phrase, and I think it's a very good phrase. He has a way with words. What you can't distinguish runs you. In other words, if you can't distinguish, if you can't discriminate, if you can't differentiate the machinery behind the scenes, do not pay attention to the man behind the curtain. I am the great Oz. It's like we want to see the great Oz, but we don't want to see the scrawny little guy with the scruffy beard behind the curtain pulling all the levers and see. So
we want to say, I'm just like that. I had to act that way. That's just me. Like a really convenient excuse for Rascaldom.
It's another way of saying it's arbitrary. I am exercising my arbitrary authority as I of me. There's nothing you can do about it. Yeah. The parent is off stage, but the act continues. Sometimes you have a character in a play engaged in a soliloquy. A soliloquy is a conversation with himself or with another person who is absent. Alas, dear Yorick, I knew you well. It's from Shakespeare. Shakespeare, Hamlet is holding Yorick's skull in his hand. It becomes a symbol of death, of course. He says, alas, poor Yorick, I knew him well. And then he proceeds to talk to Yorick as if he was still there.
Yeah.
So what happens is we build up these habits originally in a relation let's say, rebelliousness against the parents or against authority in general. And then we continue that behavior even when the authority is not present. Even when the parents are gone, or you're out of school, or, you're gone in life, but you're still behaving like
a little rebel.
Oh, yeah. A little rascal.
Which is nonsense, because as long as you rebel against something, then you validate that something.
That's one part of it. And then the other part of it is when you do something self-destructive as an act of rebellion against someone who claims ownership of you, once you have ownership of yourself, then an act of destruction is only causing a loss to you. So, it's just silly. It's really, really silly.
So don't beat yourself up to make other people feel bad. That's a bad idea.
I'm going to beat myself up, and then you'll never do that again. Okay, so let's go on. Oh, boy. We're out of time already. We're out of time. We're just going to have to slow down and end this thing. Otherwise, we're going to keep these people up all night. So, we can continue from this part next time.
Okay.
Because he goes into desire as anticipation. Because desire has a forward-looking mode to it. So, what have we gone through so far today? We've seen that desire is a natural outgrowth of clinging. And clinging is a natural outgrowth of appropriation, right? When we appropriate something, we make it ours. It becomes part of my concept of I, myself, and so on. And then we cling to that. We obsessively, compulsively don't want to let it go. And then we want to, we start to desire it. We start to become attached to the mental perception of pleasurableness of being the person who enjoys that thing. Now, why is that statement so complex? Because this is a complex phenomenon. It has many layers. And the layers are all built one upon the other. They're dependent upon the previous layers as a foundation. This is called conditionality. This is called conditioned existence or conditioned consciousness. Okay? And all great spiritual authorities, and especially the Buddha, have pointed out that conditioned consciousness is misery. It's misery. It's mental suffering. We think we're enjoying mentally.
Yeah, we have this story about it that's pleasurable. But when we actually go through it, it's suffering.
Yeah, because we're not free. We are acting under the compulsion of our previous experiences. In desire means we perceive the pleasurableness of being the I who enjoys the appropriation of this thing, whatever it is. Usually something related to the body or the mind. And then we want to repeat that. Or we want more of it. Or we want it for a longer time. Or we want a bigger one or whatever.
Even whether it's pleasurable or displeasurable, it still counts as displeasurable because it disturbs the mind.
Well, that is only to the person who is trying to get out of it.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, right now, we're still talking about the Putujana. We're not talking about the Seka, the learner, the person who is studying the Buddha's teaching. We're talking about the person who is stuck in conditioned existence and has no idea that they're even conditioned. They think they're free. Yet they are in a complicated cage of their own construction. And every movement, their every thought, their every feeling is determined by something outside of them that they have internalized and identified with and thought as I. Okay, so this is going on everywhere. You can see it in yourself if you have the courage to sit down and look at it. And we recommend that you do take a look at it, because recognizing it is the first stage to freedom from it. Okay? The Eightfold Path is also a construction. It's also a fabrication. But it's a fabrication that leads to the end of fabrication. Okay? It's an acquisition that leads to the end of acquisition. See? Appropriating Buddhism as your own is, it could be the last appropriation you ever make. It should be. If you get it.
Yeah, if you duplicate nicely.
Yeah. So we are trying our best to duplicate Buddha's teaching and to pass it on in a language that does not artificially simplify it. We see this here every day. We're living in a temple, in a monastery actually. And every day we see the simple village people come and make offerings to the Buddha as if he is still present. But the whole point of the Buddha is that when he left his body, he achieved unbinding, which means total extinction of individual existence. Okay, so
what they're doing is the opposite, the personality cult.
Actually making a personality cult of the Buddha. Then this is Buddhism. Okay? It's a religious teaching which is based on the Buddha, or the Buddha's teaching, but it actually is different from, and in many cases opposite to, the Buddha's teaching.
Yeah. But at least for the people who really want to find out, they can inquire and go deeper and find out about those things.
The good thing about religions is that they keep the past alive. They keep the books, the suttas, they keep some of the social observances of Buddhist culture that were established by the Buddha.
Is this moral behavior, which is good for tranquility and insight?
Yeah, they begin the process of generating good karma. And the process of generating good karma can go on for many lifetimes, as far as I can tell, until a person actually gets to the stage where they're like, what did the Buddha teach anyway?
So acquiring good karma is really a matter of setting conditions, right? Setting the context for being able to realize.
It's a beginning, yeah. You have to have good karma. If you have bad karma, it acts as a block.
You're always disturbed.
Not only disturbed, but again, compulsively creating an I that is in conflict with the aims of the teaching. So the thing about good karma is that you begin to align yourself with some of the aspects of behavior of a realized being. For example, nonviolence. A realized being cannot, he's just incapable of committing any kind of violence to another living entity. And that's not because it's a rule.
No.
It's not because it's a moral or ethical principle or even a religious principle. It's because he sees, here's another living entity who is just like me, and if I commit violence to him, I'm going to ruin his day, at least. and if somebody did that to me, I sure wouldn't like it. So I can't do it to him either. That's authentic nonviolence. But in the beginning, we have to practice nonviolence, which means, the Buddha said we should be nonviolent, so I'm not going to kill this animal or whatever. Right? And that's the beginning. We act as if, or we simulate the activities of a realized person, and one day or other we're going to look into it and see, that's why that rule exists.
If we do self-observation, we see cause and effect sometimes also.
Yeah. That living like this in a spiritual way does give good karma, does give benefits and so on.
Yeah. And on a good day, you do something good that has a good result that you can observe, and then maybe you have a bad day, you do something bad, say something bad that causes some bad result. And then you can observe it and like, oh.
Yeah, and the rules give you a context for making that observation. If you didn't have that background, you wouldn't be in a position to say, oh, this was good and that's why I got the good result. And this was bad and so on. So anyway, we don't think that religious Buddhism should be done away with. But we think that it should be held in the proper context, which is the original teaching of the Buddha, which is to attain Nibbana. Well, we're out of time. So, even though we'd love to go on, I don't think anybody's even listening to these whole things. So, if you are, drop us a note or something.
Hope you got as much out of it as I did.
Yeah, this was fun.
Using I just as words here.
Aye. So, we'll see you all next time.